Welcome to the Arts and Oddities podcast with A.M. Hall, starring A.M. Hall. Now, here is A.M. Hall.
Welcome to Art and Oddities with A.M. Hall, where I talk about anything that strikes my fancy, to include all kinds of creative works, from children's cartoons to underground zines, to identity politics and everything in between. My guests and I will discuss how art impacts and reflects culture and counterculture, enables individualism and conformity, and have loads of fun along the way. I am your host, A.M. Hall, aka Anthony Bonafini, aka Galena Storm, aka Aquaces Mancuso. This episode, I'll explain why I have so very many pseudonyms listed, and what each of them means. Just a heads up, it's not because I'm 4 children in a trench coat. Then I welcome back E.W. Modemac to talk about chaos magic, what sort of wizardry cast iron can produce, and his YouTube channel. I have been asked recently about the sheer number of names that I rattle off at the beginning of this podcast. I am A.M. Hall, aka Anthony Bonafini, aka Galena Storm, aka Aquaces Mancuso. That is 4 names that I go by online. None of which is my legal name, at least not at the time of this recording. There's a story behind each and every one of them. A.M. Hall, the one that I go by for this podcast, is the one that is closest to my legal name. I have been coming out slowly. A few episodes back I came out as genderqueer. I don't tend to shy away from these things, but unless it's relevant to the subject at hand, I don't feel the need to share my political views. I don't feel the need to share my gender identity. So A.M. Hall was the one that I first started using when I began editing Panic's books, all of Panic's creative works. And I'm good at editing writing. I'm good at editing things that are written down. But I didn't want to share really who I was with the general population at the time, so I came up with the name A.M. Hall, which was very gender neutral and very generic. Hall is a very common last name. A.M. Hall is not something that a person could use to identify who I am in my personal life, unless I were to tell them, hey, this is me. The name Anthony Bonafini is the name that I go by in my personal life. It is the name that is the closest to my true name. When I introduce myself to people, I say, my name is Anthony. I think a while back I had an interview with the Goblins where I said, oh, I'm Anthony. I spell that A-N-T-O-N-E, which I get Antone a lot, but you know what? My first name has been, messing with people from the day I was born. I feel no need to make it easy on them now. So there's that. I came up with this first name because it is gender ambiguous. Anthony sounds like a boy's name, but the way I spell it, when you see it written down, it also looks like a male name. But when I pronounce it, the way I pronounce it and the way I spell it, it's the most gender ambiguous version of who I am as a person that I could come up with, and I feel that it suits me. I've been going by this name for about 2 years now, and it's wonderful. It's who I am. The name Galena Storm, well, this is a magical name, actually. Back when I was around 18 or so, I began studying Wicca. In the end, I decided it wasn't for me, but I did study it extensively. And one of the things that all the books tell you to do is to come up with some sort of magical name, a name that is a reflection of who you are as a person. And they tell you that it should match up with your legal name at birth in a numerological correspondence. So basically they tell you, here's how you work up the numerology of your legal name at birth and make sure your new name matches up with it. So what I did was I came up with the name Galena Storm, storm with an E. Galena is a type of mineral. It is a metallic mineral that grows in cubic formations. And so it's very rigid and structured, whereas stormy, it's very unstructured and loose. And I wanted something that had a contradiction in terms. Galena is also a nickname that my parents called me when I was very young. So it's got It's a callback for me. Oh, I almost forgot. Galena Storm is the name that I used when I wrote one of Evie's books. I wrote Elementals, the first book in the Art and Occult Nonsense series. And Aquaces Mancuso is the closest to the name that I had when I was born. Aquaces is sort of like a mishmash of Aquarius and Pisces. I'm an Aquarius Pisces cusp. And Mancuso was the legal name that I had as a child. It's my father's last name. So there's that. And these are all the names that I tend to go by in my daily life, in my online life, and in my personal life. And that's the story. And so now you know why I have so many names that I rattle off at the beginning of each podcast, and hopefully that will clarify a few things for everyone involved. And explain a little bit about me, too. Alright, let's go on to the rest of the show. So, today I am joined once again by E.W. Modemac. How are you today?
Oh, doing fine.
Yeah, last time I had you on my show, we mostly talked about cooking and the culinary arts and how you're a culinary artist.
Well, an artist is one term for it, I suppose. That may come from the fact that I'm an amateur. I will likely always be an amateur and never intend to become a professional or commercial cook, as I see cooking as more of a form of meditation or relaxation. It's very, very therapeutic. And within the last few years, I've pretty much concluded that this can be a form of magic.
Magic. Speaking of which, let's talk about your YouTube channel. How did you start it up?
Well, anybody can start a YouTube channel, of course. My first video on the YouTube channel was one that came about as I suddenly had the urge to do a video response. My YouTube channel really was begun before I learned how to cook, and it lay dormant for a few years, which can be said about just about anyone. Anyone can start a YouTube channel. Quite simply, one day, as I was still in the midst of being a cast iron newbie who wanted to try everything all at once, I had the urge to do a video documenting something that had happened to me a few times since I had learned how to cook, and many cast iron cooks often run into this, and that is heating the pan too high could very well cause a grease fire on your stove, which of course is extremely dangerous.
You deliberately created a grease fire for YouTube.
Yes, you could say I set my stove on fire for YouTube. But since this had happened to me a few times already, and also for the record, when the video was being recorded, I had company. There were other people there with me in the event that things got out of control. But seeing as how that had happened to me a few times, I actually was used to the idea of a fire bursting out on my stovetop to the point where I didn't just freeze and then run to the sink, which I should state right now is the absolute worst thing in the world to do. Never, 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 with a capital Never, use water on a grease fire. That could very well end your life and your home. Do not do that. Anyway, especially because of that, I got the idea of actually recording that to demonstrate what to do. And so I simply set it up in as safe a manner as I could. And I knew that with an extremely hot cast iron pan, if you pour the oil on it, poof, it will burst into flame, and that's exactly what happened. So I do understand I was taking a chance, and it's not something that I would really recommend to anyone. I felt like I was able to keep things under control on that day because, I will repeat, I was with other persons present. And as it turned out, everything worked just fine. Since then, I have been inundated with insults, with complaints, with YouTube comments ranging from X-rated to probably should be banned from the planet, all stating how terrible a cook I am and how in the world could I have done something like that. My answer is simply, it's YouTube. Name one channel that doesn't get comments like that.
Probably the channels that don't do anything, really.
Yes.
Anyway, so tell me a little bit about Cast Iron Chaos.
Well, I had mentioned the M word a couple of minutes ago, magic. And this, of course, is kind of a tricky subject because there are pagans, naturally, who embrace magic all the time. But Cast Iron Chaos, well, I had gone through a very turbulent period in my life, and my cooking, as I'd mentioned a couple of minutes ago, was actually it was really very therapeutic to me. I can honestly consider it to be a form of meditation, and I dare say there are a lot of people who would agree in that being able to focus and concentrate on your activities, especially a hobby that you enjoy, you could really consider it to be a form of meditation. And since I had had some dealings with the New Age and pagan crowd for a number of years before that, I simply decided to step forward and see whether or not I could consider that to be magic. For this, I was inspired by the words of Alan Moore, which also demonstrates my comic book geek history, who Alan Moore, he had in fact declared himself to be a magician, and his explanation was that magic is art. It's not Harry Potter, it's not summoning the devil, at least not yet.
Unless you count those flames you saw.
Yeah, but his idea was that the artist is really the only true form of shaman available to be found today. And he was obviously biased as he is a very talented writer, and as such, he considered writers to be true magicians. But I would say you could take that a step further and really say that you are placing something of yourself into your creations, and that, quite simply, is your magic. If you really dedicate yourself to creating a very special dress or coat, that is certainly your magic. And if you are writing a piece of software, not just to meet a deadline, but something you are really proud of, you are definitely engaging in the act of creation and you are making magic. And that is why I would consider my cooking quite simply to be cooking magic. I've mentioned that on the YouTube channel a couple of times, though I don't do too much of an emphasis of that except on April Fool's Day.
Let's talk about a few of your April Fool's videos. You sometimes appear with your familiar, who I think you have two familiars. One is a cast iron salamander, and the other is a My Little Pony figurine.
Yes, that was from my first April Fool's video. How much of the video is a spoof and how much is genuine is really up to the viewer to decide. But, I mean, what can you say about having a video in which I perform an incantation over a 100-year-old cast iron cauldron, while at the same time having copies of the Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual, Dianetics, the Necronomicon, and the Cthulhu mythos all sitting around?
Definitely letting your old nerd flag fly.
Yes, it was a lot of it was really just in jokes in that respect. However, strangely enough, that video actually ticked off a couple of people in the cast iron community who were, well, they had recently been expelled from my Facebook group anyway for being, let's just say, troublemakers. And
Yes.
that led into another story which I will have to indulge later.
Okay. So, what prompted you to put out these magical cooking videos?
Partly for the really for the fun and the humor of it. I mean, some people can run a professional vlog, or even much the same way we're looking at this podcast here. But I honestly don't have any kind of a tight schedule. I'm just doing whatever catches my fancy. And because I find myself with something of a New England bias, in that a number of New England dishes have shown up on my videos, and a couple of them I'm quite proud of. I'm especially proud of my recipe for Boston baked beans, which we happen to have brewing in the kitchen even as we are talking right now.
We certainly do. I can smell them from here. I'm looking forward to those. So, your videos on magic and your cast iron cooking in general have led you and Evie to work on a very specific project together, a project that I am currently holding in my hands.
Yes.
This is a book that the two of you wrote together. It's called Salon de l'Aristocrate Infernal. At least I think it is.
That was at Reverend Panic Bedlam's invitation. She invited me to be a co-author of that book only because we've actually collaborated informally for a few years before. I had had an interest in magic and the occult for a long time, and which, as I mentioned, led to my steps into cooking magic. Panic, on the other hand, is really a force to be reckoned with. But I seem to have an affinity for her work to the point where it was fairly interesting to sit down and do many interpretations of the artwork that she had presented to me. And it was really just a lot of it was stream of consciousness writing and then some editing as well to produce the work that you are holding in your hand there. For your viewers, I guess the best way we could describe it is it again reveals my geek origins in that it almost looked like a paranormal or occult version of the Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual.
There are certainly a lot of demonic images here in this particular book. I should re-emphasize for any listeners who may not have heard Evie on my channel just yet, but this is a series that Evie is working on. It's the Art and Occult Nonsense series. I wrote the first book, which was Elementals, and this book, Salon de l'Aristocrate Infernal,
Yes.
is the second in the series, and you wrote that one. And I edited them both.
I should mention, at the risk of repeating myself as well, that's one other thing I find I have a lot in common with Evie or Panic, in that we leave how much of our work is serious and how much is a deliberate spoof or other in-joke.
Nonsense.
We leave that up to the reader.
Yeah, you two do definitely have that in common. I tend to take myself a little too seriously, and sometimes I have to poke fun at myself for it, but this is a wonderful book. I think you wrote the afterwords to mine? I think so.
Let me see. Oh, yes, I did the afterword. You had contributed a foreword.
Yeah, I think that you approached this particular work. You interpreted the images here as if you were interpreting a movie. You're sort of an amateur film critic, aren't you?
Well, that was a passion of mine for a long time. It still is in some respects. I used to be a fairly hardcore and still amateur movie buff, so I learned a little bit about the art of film criticism. As far as interpreting Evie's work in this book is concerned, I'm thinking that I was really looking at the personalities of the entities being invoked and seeing how they were reflected in the images that I was studying at that moment.
Okay. When you were beginning to use magic and you were thinking about trying to learn a magical language for all of your magical workings, and Evie turned to you and said, "Why not just use Elvish from the Silmarillion? That's already really important to you."
Well, this is true. With certain aspects of pagandom, especially with chaos magic, you are encouraged really to use your own workings, and creation of artificial magical languages is a fairly common and very powerful part of that. In my instance, after making attempts to create a magical writing of my own, I found myself simply attracted to the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And while it could be easy to just dismiss that, oh yeah, he's using the Elvish writings from Lord of the Rings, in this instance, I would have to state that I have been a hardcore Tolkien fanatic since I was probably about 10 years old, and that means we're talking about 1977. Tolkien has been a part of my life for a very, very long period of time. He's meant a lot to me. The only tattoo I have is actually the One Ring inscription. And because of that, I did find the Tengwar, the Elvish writings, or the Elvish language. That's not even the language, actually. That's the Elvish alphabet of Feanor. He invented it in Aman, or in Valinor, before the elves were exiled and came to Middle Earth to battle Morgoth. Maybe I should.
I have to admit here, you just said a bunch of words and I don't understand what any of them mean.
Yeah.
But the fact that Evie would even suggest that you use this Elven as your magical language as opposed to trying to learn a brand new one does say quite a bit about Evie's personality and how much
Yes.
she trusts you to do what's right by you. And that's also why Evie chose you to write this particular book.
Well, thank you.
I think that just about wraps up our show. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much.
Please stay tuned as we wrap up with the credits. Thanks for listening to the Art and Oddities podcast with A.M. Hall. That's our show for today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes. Help make it easier for others to find. Or if you're listening via YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe. Direct updates and show notes are available at panicbedlam.com/podcast. You can also follow us on Facebook. Join our group at facebook.com/groups/oddartpodcast, all one word, or on Twitter at twitter.com/artodditiespod. Today's guest, E.W. Modemac, can be found on YouTube. His channel is called Cast Iron Chaos. He also has a famous Facebook group, which can be found at facebook.com/groups/castironskillet. The production and editing of this podcast has been provided by Reverend Panic Evlan Bedlam, and without her it would not exist. If you'd like to support this podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/panicbedlam. That's PANIKBEDLAM. As we produce more shows, we will be putting more content on Patreon exclusively for patrons. You can also help Panic by buying her books, to include a physical copy of The Trial of Hephaestus, on lulu.com, or one of her 2 tarot decks available at thegamecrafter.com. You can find them by searching Panic Bedlam on either site. Links will be available in the show notes. Our theme music, Doxal Dance in Space-Time, or Belial and His 7 Wives, was composed and performed by Kion Huru Orion, or as I know him, Michael. Thanks, Michael. If you would like to contact the show with comments or suggestions, you can email us at artodditiespodcast@gmail.com. Next week, I'll talk about the importance of playtime for adults, and I'll welcome local writer Jen Donahue to talk about her sci-fi and fantasy works. That about wraps it up. Remember, the highest form of magic is doing, and expressing yourself is art. This is A.M. Hall, signing off.